Good morning and welcome to the 40th anniversary reunion of journalist fellows from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. In the 5 years since the last reunion, there have been notable changes and increased awareness regarding diversity in the news and newsrooms. But newsroom diversity is still far from ideal, with many groups remaining underrepresented in positions of power and influence. Moreover, diversity efforts often face resistance or lack sustained commitment, highlighting the need for ongoing advocacy and action. Today we aim to review the progress made and the challenges that remain. In this panel, RASJ Director Rasmus Kleis Nielsen will host a discussion about diversity with CEO of Internews Europe, Meera Selva, Brazilian news editor Luiz Teixeira, and BBC journalist Johny Cassidy. Let's begin.
Well, thank you very much, everyone who's joined us in the room, as well as those who've joined us online. The video delivered the presentation, so I won't go through that again, but just say that I think we're all in this room because we recognize that in many parts of the world, journalism historically has been by white men, about white men, and for white men, and that there's been in recent years, more visible reckoning in the profession and the industry with a long history of racism, of sexism, of classism, of ableism, and we can go on with many different problems of these sorts that's plagued the profession and the industry and not always been recognized as problems by much of the profession and its leadership. It's also, I think, important to recognize, of course, that these problems play out in different ways for different individuals with their different experiences and backgrounds and lives, and also, of course, in different contexts. You all represent many different parts of the world, many different organizations, and can all speak to this from your personal experience. But to get us started, I'll turn to our panelists first to speak from their own perspectives to this. We'll probably have about 30 minutes or so amongst the panelists, and then I'll open up, and we've got Ajay with us to pass the mic to people in the room to share their own experiences, or ask questions or offer comments and suggestions for the panel. So I'll turn to you first, Meera. You're an experienced journalist and editor and leader, and now with your work at Internews, you have a really global perspective in addition to the research you've done on this topic. But if we can sort of start with a big question of newsroom diversity, in your view, has there been any real progress on this issue in the last years?
There has been progress because you do see more people of color, more people from non-mainstream ethnic groups, and more women in senior leadership positions across many newsrooms and across many organizations. Nowhere near, absolutely nowhere near the numbers that would come to anywhere like substantial representation. And it really doesn't go far enough, because what we're not having the conversation about is, what do they do once they're there? Why are they there? Are they there to just fill a kind of gap, female size gap or a black size gap, and just be on the board with their, and then kind of make the system work for everyone else who's already who's the kind of person who's been there for a very long time? Or are they genuinely allowed to come in with different perspectives, and are they empowered to allow those perspectives to turn into policies? Are they given budgets? Are they given resources to drive things through? And that's not true. I don't think we're there yet. And globally, we're definitely not there yet. So we work with newsrooms around the world, and in many difficult countries where they're doing extraordinarily difficult work. But the number of times I've walked into a group of editors who are all men, and these are donor-funded organizations. So you sit there thinking, you've had the conversations about diversity, you've definitely been told the editorial expectations, and yet it just somehow doesn't matter. And in each case, there'll be an answer which is, it's different here. There's a reason why it's not possible here. And that's only gender. And when you start looking at class and caste and ethnicities in different countries, it's even worse. You very rarely get representation at that level. And just one final point on where things are really not getting better in the media is the area of underrepresented communities that have no journalism aimed at them whatsoever. And these are communities who are minorities, speak different language, geographically remote, and it's not often economically feasible for media organizations to operate there without external support, or some kind of charitable or public support. And that problem is being exacerbated more and more now because there's so many challenges to funding in media that those communities are immediately losing out.
I mean, Luiz, you'll have a lot to share on many aspects of this conversation, but one in particular would be useful to hear from you is just through your own work and your research as well, and the experience of journalists in Brazil, which of course, you know, in a sense is a context where a minority, whites, essentially control the media in a country that isn't majority white. You know, what do you feel that your research and your own experience brings to this sort of conversation about the lack of diversity and the progress or lack thereof being made?
And good morning, everyone. Thank you. And I believe that in Brazil, the Brazilian context is important to talk about, as you already mentioned, the minority of the population is white people. Historically, due to our past, have a past with slavery and then a lot of immigration towards Brazil. But unfortunately, there's this demographic group that is always in control of the media. They own the newspapers, they own the outlets. So, but recently there is more and more talks about diversity, specifically with the entry-level journalists that are now starting to get into newsrooms. They are raising the conversation with their own editors and directors and everything. But also there is kind of pressure of the audience. People are starting to point out the lack of diversity in journalism. There are people like in social media. So the news organizations are receiving some feedback from their audience about the lack of diversity and how they should improve. Not only with like entry-level position people that are just now entering the newsrooms, but also about leadership. Who actually is making the decisions on the newsrooms? So far, unfortunately, we have few people from a diverse background actually calling the shots in the newsroom. But the conversation is happening, and in the future, I think it might change, at least a little bit.
Luiz, you also in your work, you've made some recommendations of some steps that could be taken by those who want to drive change. What are some of the things that you think could make a difference?
Yeah, so first of all, I think we need to change the culture of the newsroom as a general. Not only the journalists, but also the company, like the HR department has to step up the efforts towards diversity. And right now, we are focusing more on entry-level positions, but it's not enough. Because people, when they enter the newsroom, they don't see anyone that looks like them in a leadership position, and they are not, they're not comfortable inside that environment of the newsroom. They not feel safe. They don't think that they belong there. So a lot of people end up giving up journalism altogether. So what needs to change? The culture of the newsroom. People need to feel like they belong at that space specifically.
Johny, I think it makes sense to turn to you here in part because a lot of the issues that tend to dominate these discussions around diversity, understandably and legitimately, are focused on gender, on race and ethnicity, where there are gross historical injustices. At the same time, there are also other issues around diversity that aren't immediately visible or recognizable. You work as a blind journalist in the BBC. What are some of the specific accessibility challenges that you see newsrooms face in delivering news content to individuals with disabilities? And then we can turn next to your own experience of trying to change the way the BBC does this.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Rasmus. I think building on what Meera said, there is a lot of understanding, intellectual understanding about what diversity is, but with that, often bandied in the same breath as inclusion. And there is a lot of progress being made with diversity, but there isn't the same level being made about inclusion. When I talk about inclusion, I mean ensuring that systems and processes and policies inside news organizations make people that come from diverse backgrounds feel as if they can be their authentic selves, to get the best out of them in the work situation. So a lot of the stuff that I'm focused on is really about that, especially for disabled people, for blind people, for people that use digital tools in a different way. A lot of digital tools and some of the software platforms are set up in a traditional way, really, for somebody that uses a computer with a mouse. So you can just move about and pinpoint it with the mouse, but not a lot of people, like, a good lot of people don't use platforms like that, but the systems just aren't designed. And again, this is back to diversity. If you have a lot more of awareness of accessibility needs and to build the tools that journalists need, it really encourages that inclusive culture. We talk in the UK about the social model of disability, and the social model really is geared about people's societal, attitudinal, environmental, and technological attitudes to disability. And a lot of that is just down to barriers and people not thinking about it. So if you think of a wheelchair user, I know some people in the room here have done research about disability access in newsrooms in India, for example. Simple things like not being able to get into a newsroom if you're a wheelchair user because there's a step. The social model of disability would say, well, if you put a ramp in, you're taking away that barrier. So that's encouraging inclusive culture. And it goes all the way through the whole lifeblood of any news organization. Take away the barriers for disabled people, for disabled journalists, make systems and tools accessible, create awareness for line managers, for hiring managers, and try and dispel the tropes and stereotypes and myths about what disabled people can and can't do. And then you're really going to make progress, and then that's going to encourage that inclusive culture that we're all really need to see happening.
Thanks, Johny. I mean, I think this is also a reminder that all of us have work to do, in the sense that, the experience of hosting you as a fellow reminded us at the Reuters Institute that we had work to do. Just as in the past, the experience of having visitors in wheelchairs have reminded us of some of the challenges that we hadn't been conscious of and hadn't prioritized addressing. So everyone has work to do. Johny, you too in your work have looked at some practical steps or examples of things that could be done, specifically in this case around the accessibility of data journalism.
Yeah.
Do you want to share some of your recommendations and work on that?
Yeah, again, it's awareness. There's a big exercise that needs done in awareness. Alt text or text descriptions, for example, of images. Blind people, when they're using a screen reader to access the internet, when there is an image, a photograph, or a set of charts or maps or infographics, a lot of the heavy lifting is done through alt text, through describing what that image is. For something as basic as perhaps a photograph of a person, it's easy to say this is a person doing this, sitting on a bench. But when it comes to something like a graph, a chart about historical value of the pound versus the dollar, for example, you might have a graph that shows the historical value of the pound versus the dollar over the past 20 years, in 2008, for example, since the financial crash. Now, you might be one to highlight a point. Somebody that is sighted can look at that and see all the different data points, but somebody that's using a screen reader to access that can't, and they're relying on the alt text to do a lot of that heavy lifting. So the work that I'm really trying to get deep into is how we can ensure accessibility for all of that visual data journalism. There's been a plethora of, a massive increase in the use of visual data journalism across the majority, if not all, of news websites, but the same level of awareness about accessibility hasn't been there. And we've seen this really a lot during COVID. A lot of the dashboards, a lot of the information that was given out about the spread of the disease was done in a visual way. We all remember that infographic about flattening the curve. When that was introduced by the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, no thought whatsoever was given to how that information was going to be conveyed to blind people. And that infographic was amplified across newsrooms over the world. But there was just not enough thought given to how blind people are going to be able to access that vital health information. So there's a lot of work to do. A lot of it, as Luiz and Meera have both said, it is down to that increasing awareness in leadership. You know, if there was leaders in digital newsrooms that did have accessibility needs, you know, sure as eggs, that change would be driven. You know, there is a lot of effort and resource being given, you know, and I'm quite lucky at the BBC. Since I finished my fellowship, I've gone back and I've been given the mandate by the news board to be able to really dig deep into and build on the research that I've done. But I think, you know, and it goes to what Meera was saying as well, you know, we need that visibility of leadership come from different diverse backgrounds, you know, to be able to really, really push the message. And that's not just about disability, that's about everything. You know, a lot of work has been done in gender, but, you know, I think all of the different backgrounds and demographics and people, you know, from you know, with different lived experiences really need to be amplified. A lot of work needs to be done.
Those who wear the shoes know where they bite. I wonder whether I can suggest that we've heard some sort of cautious optimism across the panel, perhaps slightly less so from Luiz, but notes of cautious optimism. I very strongly believe that we have to sort of hold on to the idea of the better angels of our natures, and I'm a strong proponent of sort of fact-based optimism or evidence-based optimism. At the same time, I have to say, looking at the profession and the industry in the countries that I feel I know the best, I feel it's quite aspirational to call what we see progress. It looks to me like there are some organizations who are making an effort that is often just judged inadequate by their own staff and the communities trying to hold them to account, even as many other parts of the profession and industry are trying to avoid engaging with the discussion whatsoever, and perhaps even a majority. And I think a few years ago, there was a sort of a, I think a sort of a visible explosion of this around the British Society of Editors sort of denying that there was sort of any racism in British journalism, and that sort of blew up, I think, the sort of strategic quiet that I think has characterized some of the profession and industry around some of these issues. So I wonder whether I can ask each of you to offer a few more thoughts on the sort of balance between some progress, less progress, perhaps sometimes regress. You know, how do you feel about sort of what are some of the differences we see here? And perhaps also if you have any thoughts on what are some of the drivers that set apart either the organizations or the areas where there might be real progress, however limited and insufficient, as opposed to those areas where there's less progress. So, Meera, can I ask you to take a bite of this one?
Sure. I think if you start looking at diversity in line with innovation, and if you look at companies that innovate, they innovate because they accept that the world is changing continuously, and they pride themselves on being able to see what the future looks like and adapting to it. And diversity is absolutely part of this conversation. It's about saying the world is changing. How do we represent the world that we're going into, and how do we make sure our leadership is representative of this world, and how do we meet the challenges going forward? And I think where organizations go wrong is they've looked at this diversity as a problem to be solved, and then say, we have a female editor-in-chief, or we have Johny looking at, disabilities. Are we done now? Can we move on? Is that it? Can we tick that box? And this is the real problem. You need to just say it's never going to end. It's going to be a continuing cycle. So the driver will come from, the desire to succeed and future-proof your business, to understand the younger generation that will always have different views of identities, and characteristics they won't be the same as how their parents see things. And so if you kind of decide to do those two things, you decide you want to innovate and you always want to understand the younger audiences, you will have to think of diversity. And I also think there is one big threat to diversity conversations at the moment, which is this kind of weird cross-linking of diversity to this idea of woke issues, and then cross-cutting with really nasty misinformation in climate, in in race, in immigration. So there's a real danger that that conversation that was happening on a quite optimistic, healthy note is suddenly being hijacked by other actors in the public space.
Well, I mean, I think you jumped to something that I think it's quite important that we say out loud in this conversation. And I wonder whether you are perhaps being a little bit too charitable to the media industry by saying that other actors are hijacking this. Is it fair to say that some very prominent English language media organizations that also sometimes do things we might think of as news and journalism are very explicitly and actively challenging the idea that we need to do better on this, and are sort of explicitly pushing back against this? Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a fair characterization, and that's dangerous. And I think a lot of these organizations will pride themselves with some justification of having, hired people of color quite early on. I started my career in many of these papers. So, when the more liberal ones wouldn't give me a job. So they pride themselves on being on the right side of this conversation, but disassociate that, how they treat their own staff, to the messaging they put out through their journalism. And that is a big problem.
Luiz, what are your thoughts on what are some of the areas where there is more progress, some of those with less, and how we can understand what makes a difference there?
I think I couldn't agree more with Meera said. During my research at the Institute, I had the opportunity to interview more than 30 different journalists with a lot of different backgrounds, experience in newsrooms, people that were working for over 30 years in newsrooms, people that were working over only 5 years in newsrooms. And one thing that I noticed is that people that are working in traditional media outlets, they face a lot more difficulties towards this conversation about diversity than people that are working in literally new news media, like new websites, podcasts, and everything. Because, like you said, there is an urge to address diversity in a different way. In the big newsrooms, there is this kind of a problem that everything was always done in the same way, and they can't really change what's happening. So the discussion does not go forward, the discussion, because it's people in the entry level, then middle management, and that's it. The discussion does not arrive at the top of the real leaderships. Otherwise, in the smaller newsrooms, in recent news media, the conversation is more open. People are more able to discuss diversity in a progressive way. They do not view it as a woke-ish or anything. They know that there's a problem that needs to be addressed, and then they try to make changes. And because of that, a lot of people that work in these more traditional newsrooms, when they left these big media outlets, they feel like the environment's better for them, for their mental health, for their career in general, because they feel like they can progress. They are not stuck in the same position for years and years and years. So yeah, I believe the way that the different media outlets tackle the issue about diversity is also important in the conversation.
Is it fair to say, Luiz, that what you describe is a situation where even if some news organizations have been brought to accept the moral obligation to increase diversity, that they have not actually arrived at the idea of inclusion and equity being equally important?
Yeah, I believe we can say that. And like Johny said, there are not people that are diverse that actually are in the leadership positions. If there's people from a more diverse background that face those issues in the past, and then they can start the conversation and they actually try to change how the newsroom are built and everything, maybe it could change. But right now it does not happen in Brazil, unfortunately.
Johny, thoughts on differences of sort of areas with more progress and less progress, and what some of the factors are to help explain that?
I think first of all, I think we really got to address the big elephant in the room. If newsrooms wanted to be diverse, they would be diverse.
Yep.
If news leaders wanted newsrooms to be diverse, they would. But unfortunately, you said it at the start, and Rasmus, and it is important to say this out loud. News organizations primarily are run by the same sort of small pool of people. And it stands to sense, if you are advocating for diversity and inclusion, then you are advocating for putting yourself out of a job. You know, so we need to think about how we're going to crack that nut. If we do want true, diverse and inclusive newsrooms, it does mean that the old guard are going to have to step down. You know, and Meera talked about young people coming through. You know, there's absolutely no point in bringing people from diverse backgrounds into a newsroom and expecting them to fit into a business as usual model. You know, if you are advocating for change, then you have to be serious about being that change. And it does mean, unfortunately, for a lot of people that they're advocating for putting themselves out of a job. But if organizations are serious, you know, then there's an absolutely a way to do it. There is a danger, I think, of, you know, I want to end it on a positive note, but there is a danger of diversity becoming a tokenistic thing. You know, when organizations set targets for diversity. Certainly where I work, you know, we've got to 50, 20, 12, 25, so that's 50% women, 20% from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, 12% disabled, 25 from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Do very well in some, disability absolutely way behind target. And that again goes to what my argument was about inclusion. You know, the policies and processes just aren't set up. So until there is a real concerted effort, you know, to try and make newsrooms totally inclusive, and that is talking about equity and belonging, you know, it can't just be seen as tokenistic. But on the positive note, you know, there definitely is change. You know, we can see it, you know, from the I was reading 2022 digital news report put out by the Institute, you know, and there was a lot of, you know, positivity within that about diversity in newsrooms and what it is and what needs to be done. But there needs to be a bit more of a mature, grown-up conversation about how we do it and get away from that business as usual model and really make everything fit for purpose, you know, for people from all types of backgrounds.
Again, I mean, maybe Federica will, who was the lead author on that work, may want to sort of chip in at some point later in the conversation. But I think one way to summarize that piece of research, which is a survey of leaders in digital news across the world, is that all of them are conscious that there are issues around diversity that needs to be addressed. But the degree to which their organization is actually doing anything about it varies rather a lot. And even the ones who are doing things are often primarily collecting data, admiring the problem, rather than actually committing resource. And I think, Johny, I think you say something that's very important to recognize and say out loud, right? There are situations in which the discussion we're having is about growing the pie, and there are other discussions we're having about carving the pie. And sometimes when we look at top leadership, that involves that people like me have to think about what the right choices are. And that the right choices sometimes reduce opportunities for them, not just people like them, but them. And that is, I think, really quite an important thing to just recognize that there are issues of power, there are issues of interest here that go above and beyond ideals, and also that at least in the research that Federica led on, there are some forms of underrepresentation that are not a high priority, which includes class, for example, which is, I think, sort of important to just recognize that there is a risk sometimes of sort of feeding a backlash that I think we've seen take some very political manifestations, very public manifestations in many parts of the world. If we recognize, and we don't have good data on this really in the media, but there are very few working class journalists in the UK already. And if I can take an example from the institution that we're in, the University of Oxford, the most statistically underrepresented demographic group in the student intake of this university are white working class British men. I'm not saying that that means that is the most important problem to address. I'm not saying that means that all resources should be diverted in that direction. Not at all. It's not a zero-sum game in that respect. It's not either or. We can have many problems at the same time. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are going to be people who look at the current discussions around diversity and wonder, well, what does this mean for people like me? And they're not all going to be upper crust children of editors-in-chief, nepo babies. There are also going to be other people who feel caught up by this. I think, Meera, I sent a comment. So let's turn to Meera, and then I'll open up. So start sort of thinking about points or comments or suggestions or questions. If anyone is joining online as well, I'm looking at the app. So if anyone wants to type in a question via the app, I'll channel those to the panel as well. But Meera.
Thanks. I think it's absolutely right. And I think the issue is really something you struck me. If you wanted to be diversity, would be, I love the simplicity of that, but it's really, I might put that on my wall. But I think it's about saying, it's about entitlement and norms. So absolutely, it's a zero-sum game at the top. If one person is a leader, the other one is not. And so who feels entitled to take those? And I'll wager it's not the white working class boys who we talk about as being underrepresented. So it's not just about ethnicity and race, it's about educational background, privilege. And then it also becomes who's the default? So who's seen as the default? And then diversity is, there is a default, and then we will do, with a great sigh and with wanting a pat on the back, we will ensure that other people are allowed into the room occasionally, but the default still remains as, a certain socioeconomic gender, race profiled person. And so you really need to say, you need to change the idea that that's the norm, that's the default, because that section is not the majority of the world's population by any means. So there is no sense at all that that should be the default. And the second point, I absolutely think you're right about how we talk about people, because it's very dehumanizing on lots of levels. It's very dehumanizing as an Asian woman being told that you're here for the gender diversity quota, and if you're here, for the kind of ethnicity quota, it's equally dehumanizing to say you're just a white man, and that kind of knocks you out. And there are two white men on this panel who have very different backgrounds and come with very different approaches. So I do think this is about kind of really not using dehumanizing language, which will come back to bite all of us in different ways when we talk about diversity as well.
Thanks, Meera. I'll make sure that all the panelists have a chance to offer any sort of final thoughts before we wrap up. But I really want to turn to people in the room or on the panel. I make a conscious effort to make sure we get a slightly wider range of profiles of questions and comments than we had in the first round of questions after the Vice Chancellor's excellent speech last night. So don't be offended if I don't take questions in the order in which they appear. But please raise your hand. So I will start with Chanpreet. So.
Thank you. My question is to the panel. In your experience while staffing the newsroom, has there ever been a question that this is the community we are serving, and we are going to find representatives from that community, because they will be able to connect better, have better impact, and bring more, like Meera, you said, it's better business, right? It's more effective. Has that ever been done in any of the newsrooms that you were a part of? And did that then have a very different impact on how eventually the makeup of that boardroom, newsroom?
Anyone wants to take a stab at this?
I can take it at the start of this. I think absolutely it's vital that journalists from different backgrounds, with a lived experience, do get to talk about and report on things. But it's often a double-edged sword as well. What you don't want to happen is, as a journalist, to be ghettoized into just doing that particular beat. So I might be disabled, but I'm a journalist that I could report on, the global financial crash as much as I can about, lack of access to concert venues for wheelchair users. So I think it's absolutely vital and crucial that we are involved, and journalists from all different backgrounds do get an opportunity, but at the same time you do not want to just be pushed into just doing those types of stories over and over again.
May I?
Please.
So yes, just like John said, it's really important that people from diverse background are not stuck in the box of just writing about their diverse background. For example, in Brazil, when we talk about race, we are also talking about social class. Because of our past, most of the descendants of the Black people are poor nowadays. So a lot of times when you hire a person from a Black background, is it correct? Black, right? Yeah, sorry. A Black background. It's also a person that has a different background in terms of education, in terms of where they worked before, where they live. Brazil is a huge country. So sometimes a big newsroom from the biggest city in Brazil, São Paulo, may hire people from a different state of Brazil. And those people also have a very different background and experience from people from São Paulo. And it's also an issue specifically in Brazil because sometimes the media located in the biggest city like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, or Brasilia, they only write about São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, or Brasilia, and they sell itself as a national newspaper, national media, and the coverage is not really national. They are located in this specific city and they're reporting about a different place. Sometimes it feels like it's a very completely different country in Brazil. So we have this issue, and yes, when we consciously hire people from a different background, it definitely affects how we are reporting everything, not only race, not only gender, not only like it's very different. It impacts a lot of different ways of the newsroom.
I mean, just to offer one personal take on what you asked, Preet, I think Luiz said something that sounded almost appreciative of the role of social media. I think there are some parts of polite company you'd be escorted from the building by expressing such sentiment, but you're not in such company here. Personally, I think the sort of way in which digital media has enabled by us, for us media is one of the defining positive developments of our times, in particular for communities that were poorly served historically. And I think we've seen that extremely powerfully in many countries across the world, even if the powers that be and status quo organizations try to clamp down. You know, I think Black Lives Matters in the United States was a very, very powerful illustration of that. The problems of police violence against Black communities is not new. And it's not the lack of journalists at American newspapers in the 1990s that helped account for the lack of reporting on this issue, right? I mean, there are other factors at play, and mobile phones and social media were very powerful, and the cultural emergence of Black Twitter in holding power to account around those murders. I think the thing where this really gets sort of quite challenging is that in part, as both Luiz and Johny says, is sort of the risk of sort of boxing in, saying, oh, you know, you're working class, you have to cover poor people, or you're Black, you have to cover your community, and that's the only thing, and you'll also be sort of you know, put in your box. But there are organizations who believe that they're for everybody, even if they communicate all the time that they're really not, right? You know, here is this wonderful, you know, holiday house you can buy for a mere $500,000. You know, this is not news for everybody. I mean, this is very clearly signaling who is for and what it's for. And I just think there are some organizations that haven't been very honest with themselves about this. And I will always say to editors and executives when I talk to them that there are only two kinds of media left in the world. There are niche media who know that they're niche media, and then there are niche media who think that they're mass media. So I think we need a reckoning with that as well. But there are other questions in the room, I think. I'll take Federica, and then I'll turn to Philip.
Thank you. You all mentioned how some organizations in some cases are making some progress in thinking about bringing diverse talent in. But we also mentioned how not as much is done on creative and inclusive, really working environment once that talent is in. There is a journalist, his name is Kim Bowie in the United States, who wrote quite extensively about the burden that is put on those people who are brought in to represent something, and how much that burden falls on them to then being strong and being the one who makes it, to be the example for everyone else, to be that person that shows that there is some diversity. What can we do as a systemic level, as organizations, but also on a personal level, each of us as allies, as ambassadors and advocates, to make sure that the burden doesn't fall on the people brought in to represent the diversity, but it really creates a truly inclusive culture? What can we do?
Thanks, Federica. Luiz, I'll ask you to start responding to this, but before that, I'll suggest Philip ask his questions as well to make sure we get some more questions.
Thank you. I come from a very privileged background as a white journalist in a white city in Central Europe, in Vienna. And my experience was that whenever the economic background is fine, we love to talk about diversity and including people. And whenever there are clouds on the sky, this is the first thing that drops from the agenda. And it was my personal experience as well. We tried to run a program in our newsroom, which was running fabulously. It was a first pretty small step of including minority journalists into our newsroom. They were supposed to be the first, there were twos, and they were supposed to be the first step to find other talents from the school, to have role models, to have kind of people to look up to. The economic downturn took this to a grinding halt, and I'd like to know from you and maybe from other members of the audience, what is the economic argument pro diversity in such a situation? Because economic downturn is something that comes with the media all the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. I know, Meera, you alluded to this in a way, so I'll maybe suggest you go
Yeah.
first on the second question. Thanks, Philip. So, Luiz, do you want to speak first to Federica's question about allyship?
Yeah. The problem is when people are hired to fill a quota in the newsroom, it takes a really burden in their mental health. They feel really pressured to be a role model. They feel pressure they cannot ever be wrong about anything because they're representing a whole different people, a whole demographic group, just because they're there. So in my research, unfortunately, I talked with people that were facing mental health issues because they felt like the newsroom was not a place where they just could be themselves, and they could not afford to make mistakes like their colleagues that were from different backgrounds, their white colleagues. For example, in my own personal example, when I'm in the newsroom, I am the only one like trying to raise these issues, trying to make this conversation happen. And sometimes you do not want to be that person that only talks about diversity in the newsroom. You just want to be one more journalist in the newsroom working the same as your colleagues. So it's something that sometimes is a burden. And I think the organization in general needs to tackle it. They need to be worried about the mental health of their own employees. During the pandemic, for example, we had the experience of hire psychologists to see how people are doing working alone from this and everything. But it was an effort because of the pandemic. It was an effort because of we need to tackle how are the mental health of our own employees. So maybe this is something that could be done to help them.
Thanks, Luiz. Meera, do you want to take on Philip's question?
Sure. I think I always remember Dorothy Byrne, who used to run Channel 4 News, gave one of the first things we did at the Reuters Institute on diversity, and it came from a lecture, the McTaggart lecture she gave at Edinburgh, and it was basically saying if you don't have a diverse newsroom, you're going to get the news wrong. That's fundamental. So why are you journalists? Why are you running a media outlet if you're going to get the news wrong? What's the point? And I agree that often it's seen as a luxury, you know, diversity programs are seen as a luxury and a nice to have that can be knocked out. It's completely short-sighted because the root of your economic problems is never that your nice newsroom is too diverse or that you're running this program. That's not the reason you're losing money. You know, there are other reasons. And the tackling diversity enables you to be innovative, to find the new audiences, to kind of find the new ways of thinking, crucially, and the different ways of thinking that are going to get you out of the rut that you've fallen into. So that's the strongest message, I think, to say to newsroom leaders. That diversity is not a luxury that we can put aside like ping pong tables or free lunches at hard times. It's something else. It's fundamental to the existence of the organization.
And I would agree with that. I think there has been a lot of research done on the return on investment value of diversity. You know, at a time when there's a lot of competition for digital news, more and more and more and more different platforms for people who've got eyeballs to go to. If you are making a concerted effort to really reach diverse audiences in a serious and untokenistic and unpatronizing way, you know, that return on investment is going to be a lot more valuable to what that outlay is about employing more diverse people. Absolutely.
I'll just add to it. I think both Meera and Johny have spoken to what a lot of research suggests, that there is a real documented long-term return on investment, which is further accentuated in a world where tons of research suggests that one of the reasons younger people are turning away from many established mainstream news organizations is not that they can't access it, they can. It's not that they don't care about public life, they do. In fact, often deeply and enthusiastically more so than some other people, is that they don't see their own experiences and values and worldview reflected in the people and the content. And in that sense, there are very real, I think, long-term opportunities. At the same time, and you know this from experience, I just want to draw that out, that it's risky to be long-term on other people's behalf, right? You know, in the long run, we're all dead, as Keynes famously said. And I just think we need to be clear-eyed and recognize that a significant part of the business of news is built on selling content to older white men who will react to the term white male privilege by saying, well, I've worked bloody hard my whole life and I'm not privileged. And it's, you know, and what they say is not untrue, right? I mean, in many cases, they're not all, you know, scions of rich oligarch families and whatnot. They're not all Nepo babies. I mean, in one of these discussions, I remember quite vividly, someone sort of really giving both barrels to a white man on the panel about his vast privileges, and he does enjoy privilege as a white man. And then he turned around and said, "I grew up in the Soviet Union. You know, you grew up at the Harvard campus," which was sort of an interesting moment. This can take many forms, right? But I just think we need to be realistic and recognize that part of the business of news is built on selling outrage to a bunch of people who may feel that the world that they know and like is being taken away from them. And that gives, I think, just a very clear short-term economic incentive. And sometimes also just we see it very clearly in many of our societies in Western Europe and North America, and it takes different forms in India and elsewhere, political forces that are very directly appealing to that sense of grievance and sense of loss. And I just think we need to recognize there are very powerful short-term incentives that means that some media organizations are going to double down on that, even if the times were good. I'm not suggesting that's everything they are. I'd like to sort of think that one should sort of pay attention to the journalism before judging the totality of a news organization, but just think we need to say out loud that Fox News is by a vast distance the most profitable news organization in America. 35–40% operating margin. I mean, it's a vastly profitable organization. The problem there is not that they're losing money hand over fist. Is that it's a different business, and that's an organization that they know who they're for. I don't sense a great sort of sense of deep, profound existential insecurity at Fox News about the composition of their workforce or newsroom or leadership, or any great sort of wringing of hands and clutching of pearls over this issue. They know who they are. They know who they're for. They're making more money than God doing what they're doing in the short run. Their viewers are sort of 70 or so on average. No one lives forever. But this is also part of the newspaper industry in many parts of Europe, is sort of serving an audience that's not so different from that. So please.
White man is an obstacle to diversity reporting. And actually, for example, I would like to say that like if you look around the room among our fellows, actually most of the attendees of this diversity seminar are female. So that actually shows a problem. Like if we have the white man as leadership in the, I'm not saying that they are not good enough to do the leadership, but the problem is, for example, in Asia, we are also newsroom is dominated by men. So when the speakers are suggesting changing the culture in the newsroom, to what extent can you influence the HR and your boss to change the culture. And from my experience, HR basically has no clue about what newsroom is happening. So how are you persuading them to change the culture? And are there any specific measures that you suggest? And what do you think about the future?
Who want to take a stab
So-
at this?
so
Yes,
one more question. And Luiz, you mentioned that sorry, I'm not very organized. That big or traditional media, they tend to report less diversity stuff, right? While compared to the new media, they tend to report more diversity stuff. Is it also related to the audience, or the new media, they have younger readership and they care more about diversity, and the traditional media, they might have like old, relatively old people or conservative people. That's why they tend not to care about diversity. Is it because of this, and would it because of the revenue model? Because diversity news, it doesn't attract much advertisement and bring revenue for the news organization. Keen to hear your thoughts.
I'll offer something, but I'll want to hear from the panel on this question. So how you manage upwards, basically. I think it's sort of a version of this question. Please, Luiz.
Yeah, about the HR problem that you mentioned, that sometimes the HR is not really suited to help us to improve our newsrooms. During my research, I found I interviewed some people, and they reported to me that the HR was actually not helping them literally, because sometimes it was a middle manager, and he asked for the HR for, I would like to please hire more people from a diverse background. Can you please help me with some resumes of people from different backgrounds so I can select them and hire them? And what the HR said was, I cannot do it because it's not company public policy. So because it's not a company policy, I cannot just tell you. So he has to be the one, when he receives a lot of resumes, okay, let me try to hire people from more diverse background. But because it's an individual effort, it's not a company effort, and the HR actually are kind of in his way, in his efforts. And what you said about how there are also difference between who are consuming the news, about the old newspapers and people that actually read them are like older people and everything. This is an argument that always pop up when we talk about who are actually reading this news, at least in Brazil, because these more traditional media outlets, they are used to only write for this specific background, the demographic group, and they are used to it. And sometimes they do not want to embrace a new audience this new audience, they find the news that they want to consume in the more recent outlets. So it happens, at least in Brazil. I don't know about the other countries, but yes, it's also an issue, I believe.
Johny.
I think in terms of managing up, sometimes I think you have to be quite canny and clever. And I think this goes back to Frederica, to what your question was about allyship. What I find has been very useful is to find a very senior leader in my organization and really build a relationship with them and get them to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the advocacy work. The BBC has got a lot of staff networks. We've got a series of 9 staff networks. I'm the co-chair of BBC Ability, which is the staff network for disabled people. And it's not just journalists, it's across the BBC. And each of the staff networks have got an executive sponsor, and that is somebody from, as high up as the ExCo board, who will actively, open doors and advocate for what their staff networks are. And our staff network has got a fantastic executive sponsor who's right up there. She sits in the Director General's office. And she's a massive advocate, and I can manage her. She is a very active listener, and she will listen to what the issues are for disability, for diversity and inclusion in the BBC, across the BBC, not just in the newsroom. And you talk about that and have those conversations when she's in, board level meetings, even when she's just maybe having lunch, with senior leaders or industry leaders, she'll talk about it and really, really seriously advocate. And I've seen a lot of positivity coming from those conversations that she's had. So I think managing up is, if you can find allies and if you can find really strategic allies that will, and not just be tokenistic again to further their career, but are genuinely serious about wanting to see a change. Really, really push and lean on them, to do a lot of the advocacy work for you.
Do you want to?
Just on the
Yeah.
second point
Yeah.
about why do news organizations, are they content with serving the older model, older audience? I think, the BBC, lots of large organizations have a complete crisis over the fact that they're missing the younger audiences. They know they're losing them. They're not happy with that status quo. They do want them. But I think a lot of organizations, not saying the BBC is one of them, but a lot think the problem to solve is how do we persuade the younger people to buy the product that we're offering, rather than saying how do we change the product to give them what they want. What I will say is it plays out differently in different parts of the world. So at Internews, we're doing a kind of project in Central Asia looking at, Russian language media, which is often the state-backed broadcasters, and then what are the new digital formats coming underneath. And the new digital formats tend to be in the local languages, so in Kazakhstan and in local languages, and they are more popular with the younger generation because there's a movement to move away from Russian language media generally, and this predates the Ukraine war. This predates that, just kind of more of a reassertion of national identity. And so the digital outlets that are succeeding are the ones tapping into that market, and that market's often the younger generation. But I think that generation will grow up and stay with them, hopefully.
I'll add one thing and then I'll turn to the panel and ask each of you to mention one thing that makes you optimistic about these things. So if you, while you sort of rummage through your minds to find at least one thing that makes you optimistic to share as an ending, I'll say on your point, in addition to Johny's important point of sort of appealing to people's idealism and the idea that even senior leaders has aspirations on behalf of their organizations, and that's something one can appeal to. I think in the work we do with senior editors and executives at the Institute, without wanting to expose anyone or embarrass anyone, I will say that I think in a profession, in an industry that's characterized by great uncertainty and precarity and confusion, in many situations, people look for role models and they try to imitate those role models. And for those who want to drive change, I think trying to sort of pick examples of organizations that you think do a sort of better than average job at trying to address, or at least look like they're addressing this, and bringing that to the attention of your leaders and say, well, the New York Times is doing this diversity work, or the BBC is doing it, or Reuters is doing it, and play to that sort of insecurity has worked wonders in digital, and it might actually work in other areas as well. So I think as long as there are examples, and they don't need to be perfect, right? And they don't actually need to really do the work, as long as you can use it to help your organization really do the work, I think is one sort of trick of the trade. I think Johny has spoken very sort of precisely to the internal organizing work of it. I'll just highlight the other side of it, which I think is external, right? And give a couple of examples of it. I think one is one of the reasons that Meera and I, originally with Simge, Andy, and later other colleagues, started the work of documenting who actually occupies positions of top editorial leadership in the news media across a sample of countries in the world, is that we were not convinced that the industry and the profession is willing or able to hold itself to account in terms of actually documenting where we are with diversity in leadership positions. So we thought, well, we can collect data and, share it. And then, we can have an informed discussion where we are with these things. And I do think that sort of documentation, I mean, this is one of the principles of journalism, isn't it? You seek truth and report it because you believe that this enables more informed debate, and perhaps sometimes that debate can help drive change in society. So I think that's one version of sort of an external strategy, documentation. I think it's quite significant that the American Society of News Editors stopped doing their diversity census of newsrooms. I think that speaks volumes. So I think it's important others step in. The other part of it is a bit more hard-edged. I mean, I think a large number of New York Times employees publicly organized, criticizing their own news organization when James Bennett's opinion section decided to run the editorial by Senator Tom Cotton calling for the National Guard to be deployed against Black Lives Matter's protesters, using force if necessary. I think that's a very significant moment where journalists inside an organization had the courage to speak out against their own leadership, and James Bennett was forced out of the New York Times. I'm not suggesting this is some sort of, redefining moment for American journalism that makes up for, centuries of past behavior. But I do think it's an example of sort of journalists who sort of organized against their own organization to really, force a reckoning. So now I will turn to the panel to deliver a dose of optimism before we then can move on to a dose of caffeine and other things in the lobby. So shall we start with you, Luiz?
Okay, I believe I'm optimistic because like the discussion is happening right now. More and more people are concerned about diversity in newsrooms, not only the entry-level reporters, but also more editors, middle managers, and people who don't have all the power, but some power in the newsroom. They are worried about it, so things may start to change. And the organizations are trying to improve. It's not perfect. It will take a long time, but they're at least trying to do something right now. Like 5 years ago, nothing was being done about diversity. Now there are some efforts to the matter. So yeah, I'm optimistic because I think in the future, things might be better than they are now.
Johny, what makes you optimistic, if anything?
It's a heavy sigh.
I agree 100% with Luiz. I think the conversations are being had, which is a real area of optimism. The awareness is coming through. I think we need to move on from that. How long can we sit and talk about it in an intellectual way about how important diversity is and how we need more diverse newsrooms? I think we need to put some sort of a time limit on you just navel gazing and talking about it. I think being optimistic, yes, the conversations are being had, but with a dose of pessimism, we need to make sure that those conversations just don't keep going and going and going, that we do see actual change.
Meera.
A kind of amalgamation of those. I think people are getting louder about advocating for themselves. So the example you gave of the New York Times, it's the staff saying, we recognize this is wrong, we are going to organize and bring about change, and we feel we're entitled to. And it's that sense of entitlement. So when I talked about who feels they're entitled to be at the table, who feels entitled to be a leader, I do think we're seeing more people saying, I am also entitled to be at the table and to take up these leadership roles. So that's where the optimism will be, because they just need to keep being allowed, and they need to not be told ever to shut up when they keep causing trouble.
Go out and cause trouble.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Luiz, I think this is you. That might come in handy at some point. Yeah.
Thanks, Johny. That was great. That was good.
Thank you for joining us.
I think you're absolutely right.
I was really nervous.
Yeah.
Sorry if I stumble a little bit.